Hey guys, it's Harrison alongside Josh. Sorry for the hiatus for a bit, but we are back on the Awkward Sports Podcast. And we're going to talk some Gator football and ACC expansion. I don't care what the final score last night is. I got my Team USA Go Gators shirt, whatever you want to call it, on because I still believe in Billy, even after how rough last night was.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And going into the season, right, this was something that we kind of looked at heading in from the offseason that this was just going to take time. Billy Napier is not one of these coaches like a Josh Heupel or a Kirby Smart that just figures it out immediately year two. Some of these players and some of these recruiting classes he's been putting together have been down the road. So next year they're going to get more players in. Basically, the goal is this year is to not be a complete embarrassment away from the field. This year on the field, there's going to be a lot of losing. But let's just dive into last night's game. Some takeaways I think
Right.
I have from it. I mean, obviously, we can talk about, both teams, Florida being on the road. They have struggled. They were 1-5 last year on the road and only one home loss. So to me, I mean, the swamp does matter for these teams. Because they have struggled so much away from that venue. But if you look at just the way this team had played, the offensive line, obviously, there's a lot of work to be done there. For the most part, I thought it was a subpar performance from the offensive line, but there's just no right tackle. I mean, Florida does not have one.
They just don't
Uh,
have an offensive line.
yeah, it
Like
was
you
it
like
was
you were
pretty
telling me
bad.
last night, they don't have a right tackle. I'm sorry, but Graham Mertz got sacked from more sides than one. It is, and as much as I love this upcoming recruiting class, one big glaring issue still for me, stacked on defense, stacked on wide receiver talent. DJ Lagway, obviously, five-star quarterback, but there's very little for the offensive line coming in. Like they are banking on a lot of transfer portal talents to make sure that they can succeed in the trenches. And the result was last night that Montrell Johnson and I almost said Travis Etienne, Trevor Etienne were only able to combine for 10 carries and what was it, 31 yards?
Yeah, I mean, the running game obviously was not great. You'd like to see more of ETN, especially out in space, because he's a very good pass catching back. But you touched on quarterbacks and obviously ones that are coming down the road. I wanted to touch on, Mertz's performance last night.
Yeah,
I
I didn't
think
think he actually
that
played that bad.
Yeah, I think what I saw from Graham Mertz was there were a few things I would obviously like to see improved, and obviously you go down the road and you'll see that as the season goes along. Yes, we can talk about the poor offensive line play, but there were times that I felt like he just held on to the ball too long, where he could have
Yes.
just, if nothing's there, throw the ball away. But for the most part, his down the field passing game, it was sharp. Some of these throws that he was making, I mean, it just blew me away. I mean, some of these throws in the tight coverage to Marcus Burke, the big touchdown throw that he had in the fourth quarter. I mean, those were money throws, and it was like those throws kind of reminded me a little bit of what Trask was able to do so well. Obviously, when Florida had Anthony Richardson following that, you got a lot of the wow factor and the running ability, but the accuracy always wasn't pristine. And you saw sharp, accurate throws from times from Mertz. And at times, yeah, he just did need a little bit more time to let some of those plays develop. I do think, getting into his reads a little bit better will help him, and I think that'll come naturally as the season goes on. But for the most part, I was actually kind of pleased with how Graham Mertz performed, given what he was kind of having to deal with up front.
I agree. And in the end, you really can't be upset when someone completes more than 30 of 40 attempts, has over 300 passing yards. I know he only had one touchdown, but it wasn't like there was much to, move downfield. He did that one pick was rough. The one pick he threw was very rough, and it resulted in Utah taking it to the house a couple plays later. But all in all, like I can say it wasn't his fault. You're going to have him throw still 35, 40 attempts per game, even if there is a running game. So we saw half of the plan succeed. We saw that Mertz has something there. But if we had last night's running game in this Gator football game, they would have won. Probably, they still would have given up probably 24 points, even if a lot of it was on the offense, turning the ball over, not getting, good field position, all that. But if they had had last year's running game with what Mertz did last night, they probably would have put up 35 points and won the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, and you kind of touched on it with those numbers right there. I think one of the things you can kind of look at that game from, and obviously there's two sides to every story and every perspective, but one of the things that I noticed from this Gator team was, yeah, they lost, and yeah, they looked pretty embarrassing as far as discipline goes and how they were able to perform on the field. But a lot of it was they were beating themselves. There is nothing worse. There is not a worse feeling to me than when you see a team go out and play football and they actually play a pretty perfect game and then they still lose, and you kind of go back and reflect and it's like, well, there's nothing you could do better, and the other team was just better than you. Florida really beat themselves a lot. Two number threes on a special teams fourth down. I mean, that just kind of reminded me of the old era. I thought the discipline was going to be much better under Billy Napier, and obviously it's just week one, and it can continue to build throughout the season. But last night, I thought Dan Mullen was on the sideline as far as discipline went. We had too many 3rd-and-1 penalties, and as a result of those penalties, they were 0 for 6 on 3rd down in the first half. I mean, you just if you're not converting on 3rd downs, I mean, you're not going to be scoring a whole lot of points anyways, which ultimately led to 7 straight quarters of Gator football, no touchdowns. I mean, that is just, shaking my head unacceptable.
No, last night was an unacceptable game. And the truth is, like, they kind of got lucky. It was a week one loss. They can still argue, and I honestly will too. To say the altitude was not a factor. I mean, in the end, they still had a terrible road record last year. They lost to Vanderbilt in a, totally oxygen filled Nashville. But at the same time, like, I think that was a factor. I think if this was at, even a normal city, like, they're in Florida, they're more or less sea level, but in a regular city, I still think they do a bit better. Like, and I'm just going to bring up a hockey example. We saw what happened with the Lightning when they went to Colorado. I know it's higher up. You saw in game 2, once they had sat there for a few days, they got smacked, but then they went to a normal altitude and they played better. Anyway, that's my last hockey reference during this college football talk. But I just want to throw in another altitude example in sports that's in recent memory. I'm not going to be that guy who's going to say, oh, with the way they played in obviously, if they play that way in week 1, every game, they're going to go 2-10. Your wins are Charlotte and McNeese, and that's it. Even Vanderbilt's coming for you. I still think it's going to get better. And I put this on X, formerly known as Twitter, earlier today. And a lot of Florida fans probably will not like that I made this comparison, but I used Mike Norvell as a defense for Billy Napier. You have 2 really bad years. I know the first year for Norvell is COVID, but let's just use even just the second year as an example. They start off 0-4. They have a bad loss to Jacksonville State. As the season goes on, they start to rally. And in year 3, they go 10-3. They finish 11th in the AP poll. And this year they started off in the top 10. Some teams, especially when you come in a rebuild, FSU was left in a bad situation. Forget even just Willie Taggart. The last year of why am I blanking on Jimbo Fisher's name for a moment? The last year of Jimbo, when they went 7-6. And they barely got into the Independence Bowl. It was not pretty. Like, you can argue even Taggart got a bad situation. It didn't get better. So after 2 years, they canned him. And then Norvell had to do through 2 years because the rebuild was still bad. And then finally, here they are. They are a top 10 team. I guarantee they're going to stay. A lot of people have them as a playoff pick on ESPN. But it takes time. Like, Florida needs to give, Florida fans need to give Billy Napier a chance. There's no running, you cannot keep running coaches out of town. And
yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I agree completely. I think that Florida and Florida fans, I think, need to give Billy Napier more of a chance too. The big key when you look at when to replace a coach, I think, especially in an early situation, the way that, if make an NFL reference here, the Jags did with Urban Meyer, or, some of these teams that move off of coaches very quickly. I think the big thing that you have to look at is he still keeping control of the locker room? Do people still believe in the process? Do they still believe in him as the football coach? And in house, as long as that is still the case, then there is no need to remove him
Oh yeah.
anytime soon. It's more of if you're losing and then you're losing the locker room and stories are coming out about players, being unhappy about, certain things that are going on in practice and all, other controversial things that are happening where that creates a toxic environment in a short time. That's when you make a change. But for right now, I think another ACC reference, just take the Dabo approach the way Clemson did. I mean,
Right.
Clemson had Dabo Sweeney for a number of years before they finally started winning games. I mean, it took them a long time to get to
Well,
where
look,
they.
well, look at South Carolina when they had Steve Spurrier. They
Yeah,
took like 8 years.
it
They
it
were
takes
they were
time.
just mid for almost a decade, and then suddenly they had like 4 fantastic years before it went started to decline again, and Spurrier decided to retire. But it's
Yeah, I mean,
time,
absolutely.
time.
And
Like
I mean, to your point, and also, we mentioned obviously the altitude being a factor, right? Also, I mean, got to give Utah's home field advantage credit as well. I mean, we talk about some of the better environments.
oh yeah, they have a phenomenal environment.
Yeah, their student section at that end of the end zone, it just seemed like every time we were down there, we were facing those guys. And maybe, obviously the false starts can happen, but you also can't help but got to give that crowd credit when it's hard to hear the snap count, the silent counts. I mean, they obviously weren't ready for it. Florida was not ready for the Utah environment. As far as crowd wise, so it was definitely an experience that they were going to have to take into their next big time road opponent.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure Utah felt the same way in the swamp last year. And let's see, Tennessee is at home. Kentucky is going to be the big road matchup coming up next. And look, last time they went to Kentucky, it was not pretty. The last year they were with Mullen, and they lost to Kentucky at home last year, despite all that. I think there's two things you have to take into consideration, especially going forward. We were talking about home crowd, but let alone being able to manage the crowd, you have to also understand that you have to play up to competition. I think that's also been an issue with Florida football the last couple of years, that they play down to the competition. I will give Utah a pass. It's week one. There's a lot of new players. But once you get to the SEC games, it's always, you're 3, 4 games in. There's no more excuses. For Gator football going forward, I'm sorry, this isn't before 2018. This isn't the 90s. This isn't the 2000s. Kentucky is no longer a guaranteed win. You're just you and other schools too. Tennessee is not a guaranteed win either now. You have to go into this assuming, like, I get it. You should beat Kentucky. You should beat Tennessee. That's not the same thing
Penciling it in. Yeah.
actually going in and winning. Like, you can have the mindset as a fan, they should beat these teams. But I'm sorry, but the best coaches don't go into games and just say, yeah, we should beat them, so we're just gonna. Nick Saban doesn't think that way. I guarantee you Kirby Smart doesn't think that way either. I'm not saying Billy Napier does either, but when an environment has that mindset, it's going to permeate just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I wanted to pivot. I wanted to talk about, obviously there was a whole lot of yikes yesterday, but let's talk about a few bright spots that I liked from this team going forward. And I think that, you look at first and foremost, Eugene Wilson the third, Trey Wilson. That guy is explosive out in space. He is fast. He makes
Yes.
plays. I love him already. I mean, he's getting his a true freshman. He's out there and he's already making an impact. And when you have, it's when you see players that do that week one, true freshman, and you're already seeing that kind of impact, you kind of know that if they just continue to put the work in, that's a special player you can build an offense around. I really liked what I saw from him. On the flip side, on defense, Shamar James. I mean, talk about closing speed at linebacker. I mean, he's out there making plays. And one of the things that they talked about, or at least the broadcast crew talked about in the game last night, was how much deeper this Florida defense is this year. They do need to get more athletic back there, but Shamar James is one of those
True.
guys that is already one of those guys. And if you look at the way that the defense performed, obviously they didn't come up with any exciting play, right? But
Oh,
they
but the
gave up
problem was they couldn't do
270
the
yards.
basics in the past. We were
Right. No.
complaining,
Oh,
everyone
it
was
was
complaining this team just couldn't tackle.
no, it
Now at
was.
least they're getting some stops.
Oh yeah, like two years ago, it was abysmal. And the way this defense turned around, even a little bit last year, and now what I've seen week one, obviously you can talk about Utah missing some players, but you have like they gave up 270 total yards, and 70 of those yards was on one play. So, and again, week one, miscommunications are going to happen. I like this. I like this defense going forward, and I think this defense has nowhere to go but up. I think Austin Armstrong is a guy, defensive coordinator, that's got not just a future at University of Florida. I think he's got a future in football. I mean, I think is one of those next big time defensive coaches, and I think once he gets more of his talent in here, we're going to start seeing that even more from him because after that first play, I mean, 200 yards the rest of the game allowed. That's fantastic. I mean, that's been much better than what Florida defense has been in years. And if you had had a defense like that when Florida was putting up numbers with Kyle Trask and Kyle Pitts, you're talking about maybe an undefeated season. The games that they lost 61 to 54 to Bama. I mean, they're not. This defense isn't giving up 61 points.
They lost 52 to 46 to Bama, but that's beside the point. Here's two takeaways. One, if you had the 2019 defense and the 2020 offense, that team wins the national championship because you still had, CJ Henderson, Jonathan Grenard, all these guys. But, the defense is improving. It shows, and it's also great for the recruits. For 2024, they stick around because they see Armstrong is turning these guys into some dudes slowly but surely. Imagine what they would do on defense if they had us. Because the freshman talent's already looking spectacular. I'm not sure what it will help with the offensive recruits, but if you're on defense, you're thinking Florida is going to be the place for me if I want to go to the NFL and really shine in the backfield or on the front seven. It's going to be great for them. So
yeah, I think that's something. And again, sorry to cut you off, but I think that's something that, despite year in and year out, how the down years of Florida football, the up years of Florida football, whatever years you want to bring in, there's always been this level of standard in the defensive secondary at University of Florida, bringing in it's from Kyer Elam to C.J. Henderson to Chauncey Gardner-Johnson to Marcus May. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Joe Hayden, I mean, Reggie Nelson, you can keep on going. They always have some kind of star player back there that's out there to make plays. I think that obviously we'll see who that will become this year. But there's always just been a standard of that success regardless of the win-loss record for Florida. They bring in defensive backs and they send those guys to the league.
Absolutely. But on that note, I think we've stretched thin on Gator football. We're moving on to some big news that broke earlier today. The ACC is bringing in Stanford, Cal, and SMU. Pac-12 is dead. I think we can we knew it was dead before, but now it's like, dead because now
just drop the one. I mean, it's honestly the Pac-12 should be thanking the most recent move because they can just drop the one from their logo and they still got the two, so it's now the Pac-2. No, I mean, I hope that Oregon State and Washington State that are left out there, I hope that somebody does go ahead and scoop them up. I think that it's kind of tough that they've kind of gotten the short end of this whole thing, but the Big Ten, they really wanted Oregon, they wanted Washington. And, a lot of these conferences, they see after what the SEC did with Texas and Oklahoma, all these other conferences, they wanted to, kind of gear up as well, especially the Big Ten. So it's kind of been gravitating that way. And the Big 12, obviously, have been bulking up too as well.
Listen, this is the future of college football. You go where the money is because you just need to compete. A lot of people say greed's an issue, and who knows? I'm not going to necessarily say that's not the case. But at the same time, if you're a school and you want to stay competitive and you want to stay relevant, You need to go where there's the right TV contract, where there's a good strength of schedule. The Pac-12 had a TV contract issue for the longest time, and everyone just took where they could go. They went for stability. And ironically, ended up being the Big 12 after a couple of years where we thought the Big 12 was going to die after Texas and Oklahoma went to the SEC. And even before that, with like, Colorado and Nebraska leaving, Utah picking the Pac-12, and, some of these schools are now in the Big 12, which leads to more irony. Colorado went back. It's interesting to just see how things have changed. Things have changed. Like, go back 10 years. And yeah, no, 10 years ago was the last year of the Big East, right?
It's been
2013.
a minute, I think. I mean, if you look at, how long ago it's been, obviously the conference realignment's been absolute bonkers recently. My biggest thing, I think, with the whole conference realignment is I wonder how it's going to affect recruiting. If you look at, let's say your University of Southern California, for example, right? You have
Right.
Lincoln Riley, Caleb Williams, those guys. That's an attractive destination. We all know that. USC football is coming back, but now they're going to the Big Ten. And there's a recruiting hotbed that are most players are coming from the East Coast, and and some of those guys are around that area, the Ohio area, the Illinois area, even in the Southeast as well. Now that USC is going to the Big Ten, their road games are not bus rides. You're going across the country. So like I wonder how that's going to impact, players that are going to be like, "Oh, well, I'm going to go all the way out here just to come back home." Like it'll be fascinating to see as one example, like what that'll do.
I think
Or
it also
maybe
depends.
maybe it'll be a plus. I mean, who knows?
Who knows? I think it depends on the sport. If you're in basketball or baseball, it's definitely going to be more of an issue. I think if you're in a weekly sport like football or volleyball, I don't think it'll be as big of a problem. Because think about it, you're a football player, you're from Iowa, and you get to say this: I can still be a Big Ten athlete, and I get to hang out in Southern California under Lincoln Riley, and I get to still play all the schools I wanted to play my whole life. And also USC is really good right now. I
They
don't know.
are.
Who knows? It could be like Nebraska where you move conferences and it's never the same. Or it could be like Miami after they go to the ACC and it's just never the same. But some schools just make the jump. And at least at this point in time, I would say for certain sports, it's going to be fantastic. Now, that being said, too, for the more frequent sports like baseball or basketball, I think we're starting. It might be a moot point given how national these conferences are becoming. I mean, look, the ACC just added Cal and Stanford. At this point, the closest thing to a regional conference is the SEC now. The Big 12 goes from this way to this way across the country almost to themselves.
Yeah, the ACC is going to have to change like the PACC or the APCC.
Exactly. Like, let's see, the Big 12 goes from West Virginia all the way to Oregon. That is the Oregon. And it's not quite the Oregon Trail, but like
Central
you
Florida, Central Florida as well.
they
So
have UCF.
yeah,
They're
so
going
you have like
3,000 miles across.
these conferences are all like coast to coast now, with the exception of the SEC. And it's kind of funny because the original meme was like, why are they calling themselves the Southeastern Conference when they
Right.
have Texas A&M or Missouri? Like now they're the most regional conference out of all the conferences.
It's honestly laughable. But really, it's almost just practice for professional sports now. You could argue maybe someone could look like this isn't going to happen because the SEC is too good of a conference, but someone could say, in theory, if I want to practice, getting ready for the pros, do I want to go to this regional conference or this conference with major schools where I can practice going coast to coast, playing out west, playing in different time zones? I don't, I'm just throwing a pure hypothetical out there. I'm not saying it's going to damn the SEC. There's no way it is at all. I think the SEC eventually will probably expand across the country too. But we'll see. It's fascinating to think of just like the pros and the cons that come from these realignments.
Yeah, and I think also it's inappropriate out of any time that it would ever happen, if it were to happen, especially for football, it's definitely an appropriate time because look, the playoff is expanding anyways. So the whole bowl tie-in thing is kind of already dead because they're all going to be playoff games, from what I understand. So it's like that's kind of a thing of the past. But you also look at, kind of, what you talked about with depending on the sport and how it's going to work out for these teams. It's going to be obviously fascinating. Everyone wants their piece of the pie, even if it's a smaller piece, because it still might be a bigger small piece of it might be bigger small piece of a bigger pie, if that makes any sense, as
Right.
opposed to a big piece of a small pie. So it's like one of those things where it's like, yeah, it is. It's a lot about the money, and it'll be interesting to see more matchups that we haven't seen in a while. But also, yeah, I mean, some of the rivalries will be fewer and farther between. So it'll be interesting to see, obviously, the way the pros and cons, and obviously it doesn't seem to be over yet. Other teams are obviously still kind of looking for ways in and out of certain conferences.
True. Now, I'm going to say one more controversial thought. How long until, and you can tell we used to talk about this even in the University of Florida newsroom, how long until football just goes full independent from like the NCAA at this point? So it just becomes its own business when you think about it. Just with the way things are going, it's like, all right, we're going to start off with shifting conferences around, but what if we want our own thing and we just become NFL minor league?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, and obviously, you talk about some of these sports and how they're kind of fed up with the NCAA. Some of these analysts have been talking on their podcasts, mostly recently, about a player that got denied a waiver of immediate eligibility because he had transferred twice due to mental health, issues with what happened on the field with certain coaches, and the NCAA just letter to the law denied it. I don't want to go too much into it, but it's just another example of how people are upset with the NCAA. So I'm sure whenever the opportunity presents itself in a way that won't, impact them severely, I think it'll happen eventually. And who knows? You could see if once they're able to do it, who knows if basketball is quickly going to be next or what will happen after the fact. So it'll also be fascinating to see how that unfolds down the road as well.
Yep, sports is an ever-changing landscape, and we're just here to tell you how it goes. But until the next episode, I'm Harrison. That's Josh, or maybe from this direction, Zoom is funny. But on that note, thank you for listening or watching, depending on where you may be, to the Awkward Sports Podcast, and we will see you next time.